I'm going to explain the Queen's Gambit. And I feel like before you can truly appreciate the Queen's Gambit, you have to understand that the way I used to play was different. The way I used to play chess was different. I used to begin with the king's pawn. That's what I did. Let me give you an example of the way I used to play. The way I used to play is I used to start with the king's pawn, and then my opponent would usually do the same. And then, I would try to go for the scholar's mate. I would try to set things up. I would try to get my queen and my bishop out is what I would try to do. And if they didn't stop me, I would just checkmate their king. The scholar's mate was my favorite thing because it's a 4-move checkmate. When I'm the white player, that's what I used to do. The scholar's mate is a quick win. However, the scholar's mate is actually really hard to execute if your opponent knows what they're doing. Because if your opponent knows what they're doing, they're going to mess you up very badly. Because all they have to do is they can attack your bishop, they force you to move your bishop, and they can start by getting, their knight out somewhere. They might move their knight here, and they may try to protect the square next to the king here. They may protect it. And even if you do get your queen out here, they have ways to put a stop to it. Now, one thing that's important to notice, however, is that if they do this, then you just capture this pawn with the queen and put them in check. And that usually works. But there's going to be people who will put a stop to scholar's mate, expert players. But I had some lucky wins with the scholar's mate back in the day. And what I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to explain the Queen's Gambit is actually a lot more fun. The Queen's Gambit is a lot more fun because when you play the Queen's Gambit, you are not trying to go for a quick, easy win, because that rarely works. It only works against the weak mind, okay? But when your opponent knows what they're doing, you're going to find the scholar's mate and the fool's mate are probably not going to work for you. They're not going to just let you do that. So instead of rushing out with a bishop and a queen and a knight, which works sometimes, the Queen's Gambit is a whole different approach to the game. And so if you're a king's pawn main, then you can do that. There's nothing wrong with the king's pawn squares, 2 squares forward. But the Queen's Gambit is for a whole different kind of play. And I'm going to explain to you, when you play the Queen's Gambit, I'm going to explain to you what will happen. So the way the Queen's Gambit begins is white starts the game by moving the queen's pawn. And then what happens here is that black will not move the king's pawn. Now, they could move the king's pawn, but then we just capture it. They can do that. There's no reason they can't do that. But more often than not, what your opponent will do is they will move their queen's pawn. They'll just copy you. And a lot of times that happens. They may do a different move, but the Queen's Gambit is a very, very common position. So once both queen's pawns have moved out, then you move your pawn to c4. So your pawn in front of your queen side bishop. And now you're at the Queen's Gambit, just like the text above my head says. The Queen's Gambit is one of the oldest openings in chess, and it starts with the moves 1, d4, d5, 2, c4. In it, white sacrifices a pawn in order to gain control of the center. If black accepts the gambit with dxc4, white can immediately try to reclaim the gambit and pawn with 3 e4 or e3. White can play 3 nf3. This opening is very popular among modern players and is one of the best openings for 1 d4. So if you may not understand all of that, but it has text on the left side there, and you can read this yourself too. Because if you go to the analysis board on livechess.org, it will have all that text. And it's from Wikibooks. So basically, let me put it in my words. The idea here is that when white moves this pawn, they're hoping that black captures it. This is called Queen's Gambit accepted, where black's like, hey, yes, I will take this pawn. When they accept the gambit by taking this pawn, you have options. You have many options. Now, one option is, of course, to move this pawn 2 squares, because now there is no pawn here, and you can move your king's pawn 2 squares safely. That's not bad at all. And then, your opponent will probably try to do something. They'll probably try to target this with the knight, and then you can just advance it, But you've opened up the board. You've got your center pawns out, and both of your bishops can move. So that's not bad at all. So moving this pawn to e4, it's a good move. But I will also show you that e3 is an acceptable move here, because whether you move this to e3 or e4, this bishop wants to get out and kill that pawn. That's what it wants. And your opponent will see this. Your opponent is going to see that you're about to kill their pawn. And if you look at the board here, how in the world are they going to protect it? Most people will probably try to protect it with this pawn. But then if they do, we move this pawn out here. And then if they do capture this pawn, then you still get to kill this pawn. So they may not do that. So instead, they will try to defend this pawn with another pawn. And when that happens, then that happens. And if they do that, they've fallen into the deadliest trap of all. Queen to f3. The queen targets the rook, and there's no way to stop black from losing a piece here, because the rook can't move, it's trapped in the corner. They could block with the bishop, but then the queen kills it, and they are still going to kill the rook next turn. They could, instead of moving the bishop, they could move the knight in the way, but then the queen kills the knight. And then, in this case, the king can't move. It has nowhere to go. So they may try to move the bishop out. And they can absolutely do that. There's no reason in the world that they can't do that. And in that case, you'll probably just want to slide your queen over here somewhere, and to get it to safety. But regardless, black, when that series of moves happens, black will always lose either a knight or a bishop. And this is part of why the Queen's Gambit is so deadly. Now, in that specific example I just showed you, that was a case where, it's messing up a little bit because I have many variations here. I'm going to delete all the variations. So I'm still covering the Queen's Gambit accepted. So in this case, remember that if black accepts this pawn, white has the option to move to e3 or e4. Now, in the example I just showed you with the trap, this example was where that happens, that happens, that happens, that happens, that happens, that happens, and then that happens. And remember, if you need to pause or rewind this video to see that again, it's worth it, because it's one of the most dangerous traps. Now, that particular trap is one of the reasons I actually do like e3 as a move. I really do like e3 as a move. It's just a very good move. But there is one downside. This pawn being here means the bishop is a little bit restricted. It's a little bit trapped there. So let's take an example. Let's go back a step. What if Black accepts the queen's gambit, and we move here to e4. Well, what if black still tries to defend the pawn from the bishop? Let's see what happens here. This same series of events could totally happen. Now, in this case, notice we have a little bit of a difference here. The queen can still go here, but then we run into a problem, because then black can take this pawn. So that's not that great. And then if we advance this pawn to get out of our way, then black's queen just kills that pawn. So the truth is, we run into some trouble here. We run into some trouble here because one of the reasons that I tend to really like doing f3 is because when you do f3 here, this pawn is defending this pawn. However, we have the problem of the dark square bishop can only go so far. So e3 versus e4 as white's next move to the queen's gambit accepted, it's actually a debatable question. It's actually a very debatable question. But let's step back here. What if we do e4? Now keep in mind, black cannot kill this pawn yet while the queen is still here because it's protecting it. So what we actually have to do in this case is we need to make sure that this pawn is not vulnerable. Now we can, well, black has to do a move, obviously. And in fact, they may even try to move this knight here, attacking this pawn. But regardless of what black does, this pawn can advance here. But there's a problem. Now the situation has changed because we can't do a diagonal attack on the rook anymore. We can't really do that the same. So e3 may be your personal style. I like e3, but e4 is actually not bad either, because if you look at this, you start seeing that even though we can't attack this rook here, we have the ability to get both bishops out and then start attacking this pawn. But look at this. See, now if that knight moves there, now that knight can go and kill that pawn. So here's the thing about it, guys, is that you can run yourself into some real trouble because you can move this pawn out here, but the e4 pawn doesn't have a defender, and then there's only one defender of this d4 pawn. So it could very well be that e3 is better than e4. And that's kind of what I'm thinking. I'm just kind of feeling like having a triangular pawn structure where this pawn protects this pawn. I feel like that's good. But then there is the problem of this bishop being trapped. So I'm going to offer you an alternative. So I don't know if you're still with me or if I've lost you because I'm going so fast. But as you can see, I know the theory behind what I'm talking about here, about the pros and cons of e3 and e4. So here's what I'm going to recommend, guys. I'm going to recommend something. Instead of agonizing over whether e3 or e4 is actually the better move, we're going to go with a whole different approach. And this is going to be weird. But I'm actually going to be recommending knight to f3. Notice it says that NF3, this is the classical continuation. White pursues its development and increases control over the e5 square. Black's main reply is 3 NF6. So this can happen. So notice what's happening here. Both of these knights are targeting this square here. And we still haven't moved out this pawn to e3 or e4. So we could choose here, we could choose to play e3 and defend this. We could absolutely do that. And there's nothing wrong. Plus, we get the bishop out. But I'm here to tell you today that that may not even be the best thing. That may not even be the best thing, because if this happens, and remember the text said that this is common where if we do knight f3, they'll do knight c6 here. It might actually be better just to do this, guys, because now you have this pawn attacking the knight. And if that happens, the queen can't kill the pawn because then your queen kills their queen. So now we have this situation because black has accepted the queen's gambit. Black is in a tricky position because now they have to move their knight here. And they're not going to move the knight here or here because this knight will kill it. And they could move the knight here or here. But keep in mind, if they do move the knight, they're going to run into trouble. Because let's say that they move the knight here, and they're trying to target this pawn. Well, we move the queen, we put their king in check, and now black has to get out of check. So they can't move the knight back here, or they have the case of the pawn, you know, and if they take back, then we just like, there we go. Now, whatever happens, like white is just destroying all of black's pieces, and that's something that can genuinely happen. So honestly, guys, that's one example of why moving this knight here to f3 as the next move might actually be the best thing to possibly do. Because your opponent could do all kinds of things. Obviously, the possible chess games that could happen are just ridiculous. But guys, you have to realize this is insane. You have all these options here, because you could then, if you wanted to move here, then you have three defenders on this pawn. And even if black decides, hey, I'm going to advance this pawn, well, that's just dumb, because you could either capture that pawn with this pawn, or you could just capture with the knight. And that's not bad at all, because the knight kind of wanted to go there anyway, didn't it? Because then, if your opponent tries to do whatever they do, you can advance this pawn, and now this pawn is defended by this knight and this queen. And if they try to take, then that happens, the queen can't kill the knight. They can try to they could try to threaten it with a pawn, but it's not even that big of a problem, because you can still move this knight to safety, relative safety anyway. And sure, the queen can kill your queen, but then you kill their queen back. It's not the worst thing in the world. Also, there's another thing we can look at. Let's look back at the Queen's Gambit accepted. What happens if instead of moving this knight to f3, what if we do knight to c3? And this is actually a pretty genuine response. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, because one thing that moving the knight here does is it means this pawn is stuck there until the bishop kills it later. But notice the text it says on the left here. In fact, I think I'll move my video camera down just a little bit, just so you can read more of this. But if you go to the analysis board yourself, you'll still be able to read it. Anyway, because this text is free, available for everyone. It says 2 players have labeled this move misguided, as the knight is vulnerable here to a b7, b5, b4 advance. It also doesn't control d4 or e5, 2 important squares in Queen's Gambit accepted positions. The most common and highest scoring response for black is to follow up with 3 a6, preparing a future b5 thrust, which will introduce the idea of attacking the knight with b4, whilst also claiming that black can keep a hold of the pawn with a suitable defense. This usually leads to a firefight on the queen side, with a4 usually being displayed sooner rather than later by white in order to disrupt black's defense of the c-pawn. Yeah, so here's the thing is, even though you can do this, we are given advice. With the analysis board, not only can you play around with the board and try different positions and see how it looks to you. You can also get wiki book advice here. You can get advice right on the left side, and there's even a link to read more. If you click the link, it will tell you more about that position on Wikibooks. Like, dude, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Elite Chess has everything. Whether you're on the computer or the mobile app, there's an official mobile app. This website has everything you need to improve as a chess player. And I believe that if I keep studying my opening theory and I keep getting better at spotting my own mistakes and seeing the threats of my opponent, I believe sooner or later I will get to 2,000. That's my quest, okay? I want to get to 2,000 rating. And it may take me years to do so, but I'm determined. But anyway, what have we seen so far in the Queen's Gambit? What have we seen so far? We've only seen the Queen's Gambit accepted. Because, yeah, so if we go back here and see the Queen's Gambit accepted is when Black takes the pawn. And that's very, very common, obviously. Black can take that pawn. And a lot of people will do that. But I'm going to try to delete all the moves. I'm going to delete all those moves and start fresh here. Because I also must warn you, there will be times where Black doesn't take that pawn. You want them to take the pawn, but they may be smart and not do it. And there's three main responses to it. So let's get to the Queen's Gambit position again. Now, there are some options here. Black has some options. Yes, they could take the pawn, but they also have two really good options for declining it. One is Queen's Gambit declined, and this is a very, very common position. Notice that Black's king has moved one square to defend this pawn, so that if that happens, then that happens. And if you do that, then if you try to take that pawn, then Black can get both of their bishops out. And so the Queen's Gambit decline is one of the best responses that Black can do in that position. Now, there are some people who like to do the Slav defense. Now, the Slav defense is not bad either, mind you, because the same situation occurs where you got that, and then you've got that. But then, you're in this weird kind of situation because you can still then proceed to knight f3, but your opponent can put you in check here. But it's not really much of a threat, not really at all, because you can always just put your bishop in the way. And so, but, there may be players who are skilled at what to do after the Slav defense. So those are the main things, okay? So think of it this way. If you are playing as Black, I'm giving some advice for Black here. If you are playing as Black and White is doing the Queen's Gambit to you, yes, you could take that pawn, but it's risky. And I would advise you as the Black player to either move this pawn here or to move this pawn here. Both of those are good responses because you're defending that pawn. And in my opinion, I find that the Queen's Gambit decline is actually better. It's better because then you get free range of both your bishops out. And a lot of people agree with me that the Queen's Gambit declined is better than the Slav defense. But there are some loyal players of the Slav defense, and I'm not going to say they're wrong either. Because while not as popular, there may be tricks with that opening that I just haven't seen yet. There's probably entire courses. I just haven't looked for them because I'm more about trying to play the Queen's Gambit as a White player. When I'm playing White, I like to play the Queen's Gambit because I love tricking my opponents into accepting that Gambit. But there is one other thing that we have to look at, guys. We have to look at the Albin counter Gambit. And I know this is a lot. There's Queen Gambit accepted, there's Queen's Gambit declined, there's the Slav defense, there's all this stuff that can happen. And I have all of this knowledge in my tiny head, okay? This is some wild stuff. But I'm going to teach you the Alban counter gambit. The Alban counter gambit is where black moves the king's pawn 2 squares. Now this turns into a whole weird thing. This turns very weird because now white has this issue here where they could capture this pawn, but then the queen kills it. And if that happens, then white is in some real trouble. They're in some real trouble here because now because they could do that, but then that gives black options. They could either trade queens or they could just kill this pawn, and that means that that what that does is that means black has both bishops that can move out here and here. Meanwhile, white only has the option to move 1 bishop, and then we have a queen in the center of the board here we have to deal with, and yes, we can attack it, but then they can put us in check, and then how do we get out of check? Well, we can still do it. It's playable, okay? But it just kind of gives black the initiative. So that's one way that white could respond to the Alban counter gambit, is they could go ahead and take this pawn. But I think the best response for white in this case is actually to just take this pawn. I mean, it's a free pawn, and the king can't move like a queen, so it can't kill you. But watch out for this, because then what black can do is they could either take this pawn or they could just advance this forward. Now, this is really tricky, guys, because let me show you an example of something really bad that can happen here. Because if white decides, well, there's a pawn here, let's move this pawn here, well, then black can do this horrible thing. They can put the white king in check. And now you're in a situation here because now, they may decide, let's say that they try to block with the knight. Well, then the pawn kills it. So they can't move something there. So maybe they will move the knight here and block the check. But now they've blocked this bishop from going anywhere, and then black will do this. And now you're in the situation where this knight can't move. The knight can't move because it would put the king in check here. And if the knight can't move, then it's very vulnerable. Now, white can still go here. They can move this pawn and they can kill it. But then if they do that, then the black queen comes here and puts the king in check. So you know what I'm saying, guys? Like, it turns into this big old thing where, it's very bizarre. How that is. But I just feel like it messes up the whole board. It's just not very good. And so by doing this, it just puts white in a difficult position, because even if you do this, well, then you have this kind of a case where then this is weird, because you can still do this. This is really messed up, because this bishop can't kill this pawn. Now, this bishop could kill this bishop, and okay, look, I know what you're thinking. You're like, guys, this is a free bishop. So why wouldn't you just take the bishop? I'm going to explain. The reason that in this position, white does not want to take that bishop is because then we have this issue where the pawn captures this pawn. The king's like, oh, I'll capture this pawn, and then black kills the white queen. And white has already basically lost the game. But then you're thinking, okay, so what if the king doesn't move away from the queen and instead moves here? Well, now you're in some real bad trouble here, because then this gets to kill this knight, and then the pawn gets to promote. It reaches the other side, so it promotes and puts the king in check. And yes, the rook can kill it, but then it turns into a really, really bad thing here, guys. This is why the Alban counter gambit is dangerous, because then this king is here and it puts in check. So white can't put anything here. It has nothing left. The knight was just killed by the pawn, and then if the king tries to move out of the way, then, oh, that's right, we have, well, it's not, okay, this isn't checkmate necessarily. It's not checkmate, but here it puts the king in check and it only has one place to move. So that's another way that black can kill the white queen. Now, you may have noticed that when this happened, and this pawn, it promoted to a knight in that example. Promoting to the knight is what you want to do in the Alban counter gambit. Because if you just promote to a queen, well, that's not really that big of a deal. It's not really that big of a deal because now it's white's turn, see? So all white has to do is they trade queens, then black has to kill the queen there, and then it's white's turn, so then they kill the other queen. So then in that case, white kills both of the queens. And now we have a king here that can't castle. All these black pieces, they haven't moved. Meanwhile, we have an active bishop. So look, the Alban counter gambit, guys, the Alban counter gambit is really deadly. So let me tell you, as your chess teacher for this video, the Alban counter gambit is very tricky. And usually what I do when I play the Queen's Gambit is I go for the Queen's Gambit declined because it seems like it works. It seems like it works pretty good because no matter what happens, we just have this situation. And also, if white takes this, then the queen can come here. And if this knight tries to attack the queen, that's nothing because we can pin the knight. So it's a crazy thing. So what I want to tell you, like, okay, I know a lot of people are not going to like the Queen's Gambit because they have short attention spans and they don't want to study all the theory on this. Now, you don't have to study all this theory, and you don't even have to listen to me. If you want to play the Queen's Gambit, just try it out and see how it goes for you. You can get started right away. But if you want to have a higher chance at winning with the Queen's Gambit, and you're the white player or you're the black player, you really need to study. You probably need some books on the subject. I'm trying to use just the live chess analysis board and my own experience to know what's good here. Now, you may be wondering in this Queen's Gambit decline position, you may be wondering what I recommend. Well, there's a few really good things I recommend. One option here is to move this here because we don't want this bishop coming here and putting the king in check. Because if that happens, then we just take. So pawn to a2 is a good option. Another good option, in my opinion, is just moving this pawn here because now what this does is this bishop is blocked. It can't go here or here. And this bishop is also blocked because this pawn blocks it. And this pawn can't really just move because, well, it can, and that happens, and then that happens. I mean, that's not bad by any means necessarily. But it's just one of those weird things where it kind of restricts them. But I'm going to give you what I think is the best recommendation. The best recommendation, if you reach the Queen's Gambit declined, is get the knight to f3. Because this knight to f3 has so many possibilities. It just has so many possibilities. And then, your opponent may get a piece moved out. And then if this happens, then what you may want to still advance this forward. But now we have this situation where if this comes here, well, it gives us some very interesting territory here. Because there's still so many options here. Like, the game's still just barely begun. But now you have this crazy option where you can come here with the queen and you can pin the knight to the king there. And then, yes, this pawn can do this, but now you have the situation where you can capture the pawn back and the knight can't capture because it would put it in check. So it just turns into this whole, it's a very bizarre exchange of pieces. And I would say neither a black nor white is in a good or bad position necessarily here. But I think the main takeaway is sometimes you won't know what to do in a certain position. And so while you could move a pawn here or move a pawn here, it's actually best to just move the knight to f3 and then wait and see what your opponent does. Because depending on what they do, you could have yourself a very interesting situation. Like they may decide, hey, I'm just going to advance this here. Well, then you can get your knight here. Or they may not do that. They may do something else entirely, but now you can get your knight right here. Now, the point of this is that this pawn can't advance when there's a knight there. So this bishop is still very blocky. And it's still not that bad of a position, but once you start getting your knight to this part of the board, it controls so many squares. This knight controls all of these squares, including this pawn here. So black could then take this pawn, but then you could just take it back, you know, and it works. So getting the knight out is actually a good idea because you don't know how the game's going to go, but it seems to me that knight to f3 is almost always a good idea. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, notice it says here about how it brings white close to castling kingside. See, getting this knight is one of the required things that you need to be able to get castled here. You'll still need to get this pawn out here, obviously, at some point. But it brings you closer to castling. So knight to f3 is still very good. Now, there is another option that's popular to the Queen's Gambit decline. And this is a very popular option for some reason, is you can move the knight here. And it's easy to see why this happened. First of all, let me tell you why this is a bad idea. Because they can just pin the knight. Now you have a knight that can't move. It's just not good. And yes, you can put their king in check here, but then they can just block the check there and defend this bishop here. So now you have, no matter what you do here, you're guaranteed to lose a knight. No matter what you may decide to do, you're gonna lose a knight. And it's not the worst thing in the world because you still get to kill the bishop. But I'm a person who values my knights, and that's why I don't like to do that. So I am recommending against, you know, I recommend against this. I mean, you can get away with it if you don't care about a possible loss of a knight with this, then you can go ahead and do it. But personally, I don't think that's a good idea at all. What I think, what would be a better thing to do in this case, besides the options I've already mentioned, because you can move the knight to f3, you can move this pawn here, you can advance this pawn here, and those are all pretty good options. Or you can move the bishop here. Now, if you move the bishop here, then the bishop can't come here. And also the queen wouldn't be able to come here because we would run into so much trouble. So that's actually not bad, but it does have a downside because then, well, it's not bad. Let's be real. This is not even that bad because, however, you have to realize that now, while this bishop is here, then your queen no longer protects this. So there's going to be people who will get their knight here, and if you don't know what you're doing and you just start trying to get things moved out, well, then they'll take this pawn, and then you've lost a pawn, and all kinds of stuff. So it's not bad, mind you, but I just find that when it comes to the Queen's Gambit decline, the the most flexible thing to do is to basically bring the knight to f3. I'm looking at this myself. I'm looking at this myself and trying to figure out, I think that knight f3 is the most flexible move. And so that's my recommendation to um, to white. If your opponent declines the queen's gambit with pawn to e6, you probably just want to get your knight moved out to f3 and then wait and see what your opponent does. Wait for them to make some kind of mistake. I feel like that's generally good advice. And also, the knight to f3 protects this pawn, so that if the queen were to move anywhere, this pawn would still have some protection. So that may be a good option. It just may actually be a good option. I've covered a lot of material already. I've covered so much material. And see, the Queen's Gambit is flexible. It's so flexible in so many ways. And even though there's a lot of possible continuations and things that could happen in the Queen's Gambit, it does remain a solid opening because let's just start over. We're just going to start right over here, delete all the moves, and we're going to go to the Queen's Gambit position and just remember that the Queen's Gambit is where you're offering this pawn, and black could take it. And depending on how experienced they are, they may do different things. They may do the Queen's Gambit decline. They may do the Slav defense. They might just completely ignore that and move their knight here, which doesn't really do anything, but they may just ignore that. They may just totally ignore this pawn. So there's all these different options here of what they can do. Now, if you look here in this position, you'll see that out of 77 games, I have a 53% win rate here with me playing as white. So that's above 50%. That's not bad. But what I will tell you is that usually there'll be some mistake in the end game that ends up costing me the game. But there's nothing wrong with the Queen's Gambit as an opening. It's actually really good. But you always have to be mindful, especially with the Queen's Gambit declined or the Altman counter gambit. No matter whether this pawn moves 1 or 2 squares, it opens up this bishop, and that bishop can then put the king in check. So you have to be aware of this. So there's just so much to consider, and I know that's a lot of information. But in case you can't tell, I've thought about this for a really long time. I've really thought about the Queen's Gambit as an opening, and I feel like it's actually very good. It's probably my favorite opening as white. Now, what I would like to do is I would like to flip the board. We're going to just start over. Let's restart over here, and then we need to go to the settings and we need to flip the board. Okay, I want to flip the board here, and then this is the perspective of the black player. So now imagine you're playing black here. So if you are the black player, then this is what I like to do when I'm playing black. Your opponent will more often than not move the king's pawn. And when that happens, I like to respond with a French defense. So I'm into the whole French defense thing. But there are other times where they're trying to do the London system or the Queen's Gambit, and they'll do that. So whenever this happens, I also do that because I want to reach the Queen's Gambit. So if I reach the Queen's Gambit, let's see what my win percentage here is. Now, notice here that me as the black player, I only win, looks like I win 25% of the time when I'm playing black in the Queen's Gambit. I'm not very good from the black side. I'm really not that good from the black side. And let's see, did I ever accept there is no game where I ever accepted the Queen's Gambit. I've never done it. Never once have I accepted the Queen's Gambit, according to the database, because I know what's a trap. So what I usually do is I am doing the Queen's Gambit decline. And if you'll notice here, I still only win 18% of the time. But I feel like white has a slight advantage when it comes to the Queen's Gambit. But then again, there are people who study entire books about the Queen's Gambit decline and find a way to win. I like my win percentage playing the black player is abysmal. When I'm playing white and I reach the Queen's Gambit position, I do pretty good. But when I'm the black player, I don't really know how to respond. So it's going to take a lot more games. If I want to reach over 50% win rate with black in the Queen's Gambit, and whether I use the Slav defense, Queen's Gambit declined, Alban counter Gambit, I need to do better. Because I feel like if I get better at the black side of the Queen's Gambit, my rating will improve. So that's a weak area for me to personally work on. But for now, I've given you several tools for the white player, because the Queen's Gambit is really a trick that white plays on black to get them to take that pawn, or to at least get a good position when they decline taking the pawn. So I've gone almost an hour now. I've gone almost an hour here explaining the Queen's Gambit. Plus, of course, there was the mandatory theme song and my explanation of what I'm doing here with my chess teaching business. There's so much material. The Queen's Gambit is just such a wonderful opening to play. The Queen's Gambit is just very interesting because, the Queen's Gambit, whenever both sides do this and the white offers this pawn, what you decide to do about this pawn, whether you take it or whether you don't, leads to entirely different branches here. Entirely different branches. And so if you're playing as white, then you probably will want to do the Queen's Gambit at some point. Because when your opponent accepts this gambit, it just gives you so many options. And personally, to tell you the truth, I still feel like pawn to e3 is actually a really good move. I still feel like that's one of the best moves. And part of the reason I'm very partial, I like pawn to e3, is because you have to realize, and I think this will be my final tip for this video on the Queen's Gambit as white. Having a bishop here that can't move, it's not really that bad. It's really not bad, because one of the things that can possibly happen is your opponent is going to try to they're going to try to get out here. They're going to try to get their queen out here and put you in check. And so it's actually better in many cases for this bishop to remain trapped here, because if the bishop always has the option to go here and block any checks. Because if you had already brought the bishop out somewhere and gotten killed, well, that would mean you would have to defend with the knight. Because if this bishop didn't exist, you'd have to defend with the knight, and then you can't move the knight. And so I feel like having a trapped bishop there is really not the worst thing in the world. So to summarize, let's go back here. If they accept the Queen's Gambit, which you're hoping they do, because if they do, it's going to be a good game for you. I personally still think that either pawn to e3 is a very good move, but also you can always do knight to f3 and then decide later how to move the pawn based on the way your opponent responds. There's just so many options here. Now, I need to play a lot more games to really refine my knowledge of not only the black side, which I'm weak in, but also the white side. But the Queen's Gambit is one of the most amazing openings because it's so simple. The concept is so simple. white wants development. They want to get their pieces out. And by distracting black by letting them take that pawn, black thinks, well, this person's an idiot. And then all of a sudden, white has gotten more pieces out because then black is a move behind with this pawn they can't defend. Remember, they can't really defend that pawn. Every attempt to defend that pawn never really works. It never really does, because they could, let's say that you get this pawn here and your bishop's attacking this pawn. I've already shown what happens if they try to do this. It leads to a whole exchange. They end up losing a piece. They could also defend it by moving the queen here. But if they do, that's just really bad. That's like really bad, because then you bring out the knight and you attack the queen. And see, they can't pin the knight because this is not moved out yet. So they can try to pin your knight, but then you just get your bishop behind the knight. And if they don't see what you're doing, you're just going to start doing some really nasty stuff here. First of all, you still have to kill this pawn here. And then at any single time, you have the option to move this knight here and kill that knight, for instance, if it attacks, which would be a bad move by black. It's not the best example in the world. It's better to show examples with real games played by real people to really show the beauty of what the Queen's Gambit can do. Because I win over 50% of the time when I play the Queen's Gambit. I really like the Queen's Gambit. It's just amazing. I love it. I really love it. So anyway, enough of me rambling about my theories of the Queen's Gambit. But this video was meant to be an introduction to the Queen's Gambit and to really explore, what can happen in the Queen's Gambit. I think the Queen's Gambit is an opening that you should study. You should play it. You should study it. And there are grandmasters, and there are many book authors who have written entire books on the Queen's Gambit. People say the Queen's Gambit is the queen of openings. It's really, really good. The Queen's Gambit is just one of the best there is. And it's not just me saying it. There's a lot of people who love the Queen's Gambit. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to close up this part of the video, and I must do the ending theme song. Because yes, the mandatory ending theme song. We're going to do the Chess for All rap. So enjoy listening to this.
Play our game. Everyone can join the same. Pieces move their timeless dance. In chess there's always a chance. Kings and queens on either side. Pawns advance with humble pride. No one's left out in this fight. A game of skill, no dark, no light. Chess for all, chess for you. Every move, it's something new. No matter who or where you are, in this game we're all the star. Black or white, it doesn't matter. On this board, no walls to shatter. Rich or poor, we all belong. In this fight, we're going strong. Even if you've never played, there's no need to be afraid. Anyone can learn this game. That's why chess has so much fame. Male or female, gay or straight, at this table no one's late. Every voice and move unique, all together we are sleek. Anyone can win this game, but when you lose, feel no shame. Even masters make mistakes, all your games are just remakes. Each new player finds their style, when you find it you will smile. Books and courses help us learn what we need to take our turn. Chess for all, chess for you. Every move